Have you ever noticed how the moment you finally cut them off, the energy shifts? Not when you were crying, not when you were begging, not when you were trying to explain your feelings over and over again. No, the shift happened the moment you went silent, the moment you stopped being available, the moment access to you was gone. Here's the truth. Most people don't understand about avoidant psychology. They don't break down when they lose you emotionally. They break down when they lose access to you. And those are two very different things. When you were there, answering texts, picking up calls, forgiving distance, tolerating hot and cold behavior, you were predictable. You were accessible. You were emotionally open. And to an avoidant, that open door becomes a form of security, not intimacy, not commitment, security. They may have acted detached. They may have seemed independent. They may have insisted they needed space. But beneath all that distance was one quiet assumption: you weren't going anywhere. Avoidants often grow up learning that closeness equals pressure, that vulnerability equals danger. So instead of attaching in obvious ways, they attach through access, knowing you're there, knowing they can reach out, knowing they still have a place in your emotional world. That access becomes their comfort zone. So when you cut them off, it doesn't just remove communication, it removes control. It removes predictability. It removes the silent reassurance that they still matter to you whenever they decide they want to feel connected. And that's when the sadness begins. Not always immediately. In fact, at first, they might even feel relief. Relief from pressure. Relief from expectations. Relief from emotional intensity. But relief fades. And when it does, something far more uncomfortable creeps in: the realization that the door is closed. You see, avoidants are used to managing distance. They are not used to being shut out. There's a difference between choosing space and having space chosen for you. When they create distance, they feel powerful. When you create distance, they feel rejected. And rejection is the one thing they're wired to avoid. So if you're sitting there thinking they don't care because they're quiet, understand something. Silence doesn't mean absence of feeling. Sometimes silence is pride wrestling with panic. And this is where the story really begins. When you removed access, you unknowingly triggered something deep inside them, an old wound they don't even consciously talk about. Avoidants often present themselves as emotionally self-sufficient. They convince the world and themselves that they don't need anyone. But emotional independence, when rooted in defense, is not strength, it's protection. Most avoidants learned early on that depending on others led to disappointment. So they adapted, they built walls, they minimized needs, they trained themselves not to expect too much from anyone. But here's the contradiction. Even though they suppress their needs, those needs never disappear. Instead of seeking closeness directly, they seek controlled connection. They keep people at arm's length while still ensuring those people remain within reach. That reach is crucial. It's their emotional safety net. You were that safety net. You may not have realized it. You may have felt undervalued. You may have questioned whether they even cared. But your consistent presence provided them with quiet reassurance. You were proof that someone chose them even when they weren't fully choosing back. So when you cut off access, you didn't just walk away. You disrupted their sense of emotional control. And control is everything to someone who fears vulnerability. At first, their ego steps in. They'll come back. They're just upset. This won't last. They convince themselves that you're reacting emotionally and that eventually you'll reopen the door. But as days pass, then weeks, and your silence remains steady, something shifts internally. Doubt creeps in. What if you're serious this time? What if the access they took for granted is actually gone? Avoidants struggle with direct confrontation of emotions. So instead of openly expressing sadness, it comes out sideways. They check your social media. They reread old messages. They wonder if you're talking to someone new. They feel the loss not as heartbreak, but as destabilization. Because access gave them a sense of invisible power, and now that power feels stripped away. This is the part most people misunderstand. They assume avoidants don't care because they don't chase loudly. But avoidants don't chase loudly. They process quietly, and that quiet can be heavy. Being cut off forces them into a position they hate, the one who wasn't chosen. And for someone who prides themselves on emotional detachment, that's a deep bruise to the ego. Here's where it gets even more painful for them, though they would never admit it out loud. When you cut them off, you flipped the script. Throughout the relationship, they likely controlled the pace. They decided when to get close, when to pull back, when to text, when to disappear. That push and pull dynamic gave them emotional leverage. But now, the leverage is gone. You are no longer reacting to their distance. You are creating your own. And that reversal creates an identity shock. Avoidants often see themselves as the independent one, the strong one, the one who doesn't get attached. So when they find themselves thinking about you, wondering about you, missing the familiarity of your attention, it creates internal conflict. They don't just miss you. They miss how you made them feel about themselves. Wanted, desired, understood, accepted without pressure. You were proof that they could keep someone close without fully opening up. You were evidence that their walls worked. Now the walls feel colder. And here's something that hurts them deeply. When you cut them off calmly, without drama, without chasing, without begging, it communicates something powerful. It says, I don't need access to you the way you needed access to me. That message hits hard because underneath avoidance is often a fear of not being enough. Not enough emotionally, not enough relationally, not enough to sustain intimacy long term. When you walk away with strength, it forces them to confront a question they've been avoiding. Did I lose someone who actually cared? That question lingers, and avoidants are not comfortable sitting with lingering emotional questions. They distract, they dive into work, they socialize, they act unbothered. But distraction doesn't erase the absence of access. It only delays the emotional impact. Eventually, the quiet moments come. And in those moments, your absence feels louder than your presence ever did. There's another layer to this that most people overlook. Avoidants often mistake familiarity for permanence. Because you stayed through their distance before, because you tolerated inconsistency, because you tried to understand their need for space, they subconsciously categorized you as stable background support. You became the emotional constant. And constants aren't questioned, they're assumed. So when the constant disappears, it creates a psychological vacuum. They may not immediately label it as sadness. Instead, it feels like irritation, restlessness, subtle anxiety, a sense that something is off. That off feeling is the loss of emotional access. You see, even when avoidants don't fully invest, they still attach in their own way. They attach to familiarity, to routine, to knowing someone is there, to having an option. When you remove yourself completely, you remove the option. And options feel safe to someone who fears commitment. Without the option, they're left with reality. Reality that you might move on. Reality that someone else could have access to you. Reality that the emotional safety net they never acknowledged is gone. This is when jealousy can surface, not necessarily because they wanted to commit, but because they didn't expect to lose. And loss feels different when you didn't think it was possible. They might replay moments in their head, conversations where you expressed needs, times they pulled away unnecessarily, opportunities they had to show up better, but didn't. Regret doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet and persistent. A thought that keeps resurfacing at night. A memory that hits unexpectedly. A realization that maybe they miscalculated. Avoidants are strategic with their emotions. They invest cautiously. They detach preemptively, but when someone else makes the final move, when someone else closes the door, it bypasses their strategy. It forces them to feel something raw. And raw emotion is exactly what they've spent their life trying to avoid. So let's bring this back to you. Because while they may be sad they lost access, the deeper truth is this: you reclaimed your power. Cutting them off wasn't about punishing them. It was about protecting yourself. It was about stepping out of a dynamic where you were emotionally available while they remained selectively present. And here's the part that might surprise you. Your silence didn't just make them miss you, it made them confront themselves. Without your reassurance, they can't measure their worth through your loyalty. Without your attention, they can't soothe their ego through your consistency. Without your presence, they have to sit alone with their emotional patterns. Some avoidants grow in that space. Some double down on avoidance. But either way, the loss of access becomes a mirror, and mirrors are uncomfortable. If they're feeling sad right now, it's not weakness, it's exposure. Exposure to the reality that someone who cared deeply finally decided they deserved more. That realization can hurt more than heartbreak, because heartbreak implies mutual intensity, but being cut off implies consequence. And consequences sting. You may never hear them admit it. You may never receive the apology or confession you once hoped for. Avoidants often struggle to verbalize regret because doing so requires vulnerability. But don't mistake silence for indifference. Sometimes the deepest sadness is hidden behind the strongest pride. The truth is, access to you was valuable. Your emotional openness was rare. Your patience was meaningful. And when you withdrew those things, you didn't just leave a person. You removed a source of comfort they didn't fully appreciate until it was gone. And here's the final piece. Their sadness doesn't mean you should reopen the door. It doesn't mean you should shrink your boundaries. It doesn't mean you should return to a dynamic that left you questioning your worth. It simply means your absence mattered. You weren't too much. You weren't needy. You weren't asking for the impossible. You were asking for reciprocity. And when reciprocity wasn't given, you chose yourself. That choice is powerful. Because in avoidant psychology, the greatest shock isn't losing someone who needed them. It's losing someone who no longer needs access to them at all. And that is what truly hurts. Because when you no longer need access to them, something inside them destabilizes. Avoidants are comfortable being wanted. They are comfortable being the one someone waits for. They are comfortable knowing that if they reach out, you will respond. That dynamic feels safe because it keeps vulnerability optional. They can dip in and out without fully risking themselves. But when you stop waiting, when you stop responding, when your energy shifts from hoping to healing, they feel it. And they feel it in a way they don't understand. It's not dramatic heartbreak. It's not the kind of pain that sends them crying to friends. It's quieter. It's the uncomfortable awareness that they are no longer in control of the connection. And for someone who built their entire emotional structure around control, that loss hits deep. You see, control is how they protect themselves from abandonment. If they distance first, they can't be left. If they minimize feelings, they can't be overwhelmed. If they avoid dependency, they can't be hurt. But when you cut them off, you remove their ability to manage the narrative. They didn't choose the ending. And that lack of choice feels like rejection. Even if they were the one who pulled away emotionally first, even if they were inconsistent, even if they created the distance that pushed you to your limit, your final silence feels different. Because now they are on the outside. Now they are the one wondering. Now they are the one unsure. And uncertainty is something avoidants struggle with deeply. There's a stage they go through that most people never see. It starts with disbelief. They assume you're just upset. They assume you'll cool down. They assume you'll reach out eventually. After all, you always did before. That pattern became predictable. You were the one who tried. You were the one who bridged the gap. So at first, they wait. They tell themselves they're giving you space. They frame it as maturity. They convince themselves they're respecting your boundaries. But as time stretches and your silence remains steady, the narrative begins to crack. They check your status, they wonder who you're talking to. They replay the last conversation in their mind, analyzing your tone, your words, your energy. They start to notice the finality in it. And that's when something shifts from disbelief to discomfort. Because now they realize this isn't a game, this isn't temporary. You're not reacting, you're deciding. And being decided against cuts differently. Avoidants often struggle with feeling not chosen at a core level. It's one of the hidden roots of their attachment style. So when you truly step back, it activates something deeper than just missing you. It activates the fear that maybe they weren't enough to keep you. That thought threatens the self-image they've built, the image of being self-sufficient, the image of not needing anyone, the image of always being the one who leaves first. Now they are confronted with the possibility that someone left them. And even if they don't consciously admit it, that realization bruises their pride. Here's the part that might surprise you the most. The more emotionally regulated you are in your absence, the stronger the impact. If you had exploded, begged, demanded, it would have fit their expectations. It would have reinforced their belief that closeness equals chaos. They could have used that to justify distancing. But when you leave calmly, when you withdraw with dignity, when you simply stop offering access without drama, it creates cognitive dissonance for them. Because now they can't blame you. Now they can't tell themselves you were too emotional or too demanding. Now they're left with the uncomfortable possibility that you simply realized your worth. And that realization forces introspection. Avoidants are masters at avoiding internal confrontation. They stay busy, they stay distracted. They keep conversations surface level, but your absence removes one of their biggest distractions. They might try to replace the access quickly. New conversations, new attention, new validation, but something feels different because access is not the same as connection. And what you provided wasn't just availability, it was emotional depth. It was understanding. It was patience. Those things are not easily replaced. So even if they surround themselves with noise, there will be moments late at night, during quiet drives in between tasks, where your absence feels heavy. Not because they suddenly became emotionally expressive, but because familiarity is powerful, and you were familiar in a way that felt safe. Over time, sadness can morph into something more reflective. They begin to see patterns. They might remember how you asked for reassurance and they brushed it off, how you tried to communicate and they withdrew, how you waited and they delayed. When access is gone, perspective often arrives. Because when you're no longer present to absorb their inconsistency, they're left to sit with it alone. And sitting alone with your own patterns can be uncomfortable. Some avoidants respond to this discomfort by hardening. They double down on independence. They convince themselves they're better off. They minimize what you had, but others feel the weight of it. They start to realize that what you offered was rare. That emotional availability is not common. That loyalty without pressure is not easy to find. And here's where it becomes deeply emotional. They might start to miss not just your presence, but your care. The way you checked in, the way you tried to understand them, the way you stayed patient, even when it was hard. They may never say it directly, but internally they feel the shift. Because losing access to someone who genuinely cared exposes how much they were receiving without fully reciprocating. And that awareness can sting. But let's close this in a way that brings it back to what truly matters. Their sadness is not your responsibility. Their regret is not your burden. Their realization is not your assignment to fix. Yes, they may be sad they lost access. Yes, it may hurt them to know the door is closed. Yes, they may feel the consequences of taking you for granted. But your healing is not dependent on their awakening. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to let them sit with the absence they created. Because remember, you didn't wake up one day and randomly cut them off. You reached that point after trying, after hoping, after explaining, after giving chances. Your silence wasn't impulsive. It was exhausted clarity. And exhausted clarity is powerful. If they are hurting right now, it's because your absence revealed value. It revealed that access to you was a privilege, not a guarantee. But whether they grow from that realization is their journey. Your journey is about something different now. It's about choosing relationships where access is mutual, where effort is balanced, where emotional safety doesn't require you to shrink yourself. You are not meant to be someone's optional comfort. You are meant to be someone's chosen priority. And if being cut off hurts them, it's because for the first time, they are experiencing what it feels like to not have unlimited access to someone who cared deeply. That pain might teach them, or it might not. But either way, you standing firm in your boundaries is not cruelty. It's self-respect. And self-respect is the one thing avoidant psychology cannot manipulate. So if you're wondering whether they feel it, yes. In their own quiet, pride-protected, emotionally complicated way, they feel it. Not always loudly, not always immediately, but deeply enough to know that losing access to you was not as easy as pretending not to care. And sometimes that silent realization is the loudest consequence of all. Because once the noise fades, once the distractions slow down, once the ego stops performing, they are left alone with something they've spent most of their life avoiding. Emotion. Not dramatic emotion, not cinematic heartbreak, but a slow, persistent ache. It shows up in small moments, when something reminds them of you, when they instinctively reach for their phone and remember they can't, when they realize there's no one waiting on the other side anymore. Access used to mean comfort. Now absence means reflection. And reflection is dangerous for someone who built their identity around emotional distance. Avoidants survive by compartmentalizing. They put feelings in boxes. They seal them, they stack them neatly and move forward. But your silence disrupts that system because the box labeled you was never fully closed. They assumed they could reopen it whenever they wanted. That assumption is what hurts the most. You see, when someone thinks they can come back anytime, they don't feel urgency. They don't feel fear. They don't feel loss. But when they realize they can't, loss becomes real. And real loss doesn't care about pride. There's another truth that's hard to admit. Sometimes what they miss isn't just you, it's who they were with you. You brought out a softer version of them. Maybe not consistently, maybe not perfectly, but there were moments when they let their guard down. Moments when they laughed freely. Moments when they felt understood without being interrogated. And that version of themselves felt safe. Now, without you, they may find themselves reverting fully back into independence mode. Strong, self-contained, detached. but something feels flatter. Because even avoidants crave connection, they just fear the cost of it. You were proof that connection didn't have to be suffocating, that someone could care without controlling, that closeness didn't automatically equal chaos. And when you're gone, that proof disappears too. They may try to recreate it with someone else, but new connections don't carry the same history. They don't carry shared memories. They don't carry the depth that builds slowly over time. So even if they distract themselves with new faces or new conversations, the emotional imprint you left doesn't vanish. It lingers. And sometimes that lingering turns into quiet regret. Regret for not opening up more. Regret for not meeting you halfway. Regret for assuming you would always stay. But regret is complicated for avoidants, because to fully feel regret, they have to acknowledge vulnerability. They have to admit they needed something. And admitting need feels threatening. So instead, they sit with an unnamed heaviness, a sense that something meaningful slipped through their hands. Now let's talk about something deeper. When you cut them off, you didn't just remove access, you disrupted a pattern. Avoidants often move through relationships repeating similar cycles: initial interest, growing closeness, subtle distancing, emotional withdrawal, then either a breakup or a slow fade. And many times the other person chases, tries harder, fights for clarity, reopens communication. That repetition reinforces their belief that distance works. But when you refuse to chase, when you don't reopen the door, when you let the ending be final, you interrupt that cycle. And that interruption can feel destabilizing, because now the pattern didn't play out the way it always does. They can't categorize you as another emotional person who wanted too much. They can't minimize the ending as mutual drift. They can't rely on familiarity to smooth it over. You became the exception, the one who didn't come back, the one who chose self-respect over access. And exceptions stand out. They challenge the narrative. Avoidants tell themselves about relationships, the narrative that they are fine alone, that attachment is optional, that people always overreact but eventually return. You rewrote the ending. And rewritten endings force reevaluation. Even if they never tell you, even if they never reach out, even if pride keeps them silent, somewhere inside, they know this felt different. Because you didn't collapse when they pulled away. You detached. And detachment from someone who used to care deeply feels like emotional gravity disappearing. Here's where this becomes profoundly emotional. There may come a moment, weeks later, months later, when the full weight of losing access hits them. It might not be triggered by you directly. It might be triggered by loneliness, by seeing others in healthy partnerships, by experiencing surface-level connections that lack depth. And suddenly they remember. They remember how safe it felt when you understood their silence, how patient you were with their space, how you didn't demand perfection, only effort. And that memory carries a bittersweet tone, because now they understand something they couldn't see before. Access to you wasn't pressure, it was privilege. You were not suffocating them, you were offering them connection. But sometimes avoidants only recognize the value of connection when they no longer have it. And by then, reaching out feels complicated. What if you don't respond? What if you moved on? What if the door really is closed? That fear of rejection can paralyze them. So they sit in silence, feeling the ache, but doing nothing about it. And that's one of the most misunderstood parts of avoidant psychology. Inaction doesn't always mean indifference. Sometimes it means fear. Fear of confirming the loss. Fear of hearing no. Fear of facing the consequences of emotional delay. So as we close this, I want you to hear something clearly. Their sadness, if it exists, is not a signal for you to rescue them. It's not proof that you should reopen communication. It's not validation you need to chase. It's simply evidence that your presence mattered more than they were able to show. And that matters. Because if you ever doubted your value, if you ever wondered whether you were too much, if you ever questioned whether they cared at all, understand this: access to you became part of their emotional structure. And when that structure changed, they felt it. Maybe quietly, maybe stubbornly, maybe behind a wall of pride. But they felt it. And you grew. You reached a point where loving yourself meant stepping away, where protecting your peace mattered more than maintaining potential, where boundaries became stronger than hope. That is not weakness. That is transformation. Avoidants often don't realize what they had until it's gone, and sometimes losing access becomes the catalyst for self-awareness. But whether they evolve or stay the same is beyond your control. What is within your control is this: you no longer accept being someone's emotional option. You no longer tolerate inconsistent access. You no longer shrink your needs to fit inside someone else's fear. And that shift is powerful. So if they are sad right now, if they feel the sting of being cut off, if they lie awake occasionally wondering how you're doing, let them. Because the pain of losing access is sometimes the only language that reaches someone who avoided every other one. You did not lose someone who was unsure about you. They lost someone who was sure enough to walk away. And that kind of loss lingers, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. And sometimes deeply is what changes people forever. But not always in the way you expect. Because after the sadness settles in, after the ego bruises, after the late night reflections, there comes a crossroads. At that crossroads, they have two choices. They can grow, or they can retreat further into avoidance. Growth would mean admitting they cared, admitting they felt safe with you, admitting that losing access hurt more than they anticipated. It would mean confronting the fear that made them pull away in the first place. It would mean accepting that closeness wasn't the enemy, fear was. But retreating feels easier. Retreating means telling themselves you weren't the right match, that timing was off, that you wanted more than they could give, that the connection wasn't as deep as it seemed. Retreating protects their self-image. Growth threatens it. And this is why sometimes you won't see immediate action. You won't see dramatic confessions. You won't see long paragraphs of vulnerability. Avoidants don't transform overnight simply because access disappeared. But what you don't see is the internal tension. The way your absence lingers in the background of their thoughts, the way certain songs hit differently now, the way specific places carry memories, the way quiet evenings feel just a little bit emptier. Because losing access doesn't just remove communication, it removes shared space in their life. And shared space is harder to replace than people realize. There's something even deeper happening beneath the surface. When you cut them off, you modeled something they struggle with, emotional boundaries. You showed them what it looks like to choose yourself when something isn't meeting your needs. That example can be confronting. Avoidants often associate boundaries with distance, with pushing people away. But what you demonstrated was different. You didn't push them away to escape closeness. You stepped back to protect your emotional well-being. And that distinction matters. Because somewhere inside, they recognize the difference. They know you didn't leave impulsively. They know you endured more than you should have. They know your silence came after repeated attempts to communicate. And that awareness adds weight to the loss. It's one thing to lose someone because of chaos. It's another to lose someone because they calmly decided they deserved better. That kind of ending carries finality, and finality is uncomfortable for someone who prefers open doors. They might start questioning past interactions. Why didn't I reassure more? Why did I pull back when things were good? Why did I assume they'd always understand? These questions don't always lead to immediate change, but they plant seeds. And seeds, even in avoidant soil, can grow slowly. Now let's talk about something you might not realize. Your absence can elevate your value in their mind. Not because scarcity is manipulation, but because distance brings clarity. When you were present, your effort felt normal to them. Your patience felt expected. Your forgiveness felt routine. But once it's gone, they start to see it differently. They may compare new interactions to what they had with you. Maybe they notice that emotional depth isn't as common as they thought. Maybe they realize that consistency is rare. Maybe they recognize that feeling understood without being pressured was something special. And this recognition doesn't always make them reach out. Sometimes it just makes them sit quietly with a truth they avoided before. They underestimated you, underestimated your loyalty, underestimated your strength, underestimated the impact of losing you. And that realization can feel humbling. For someone who prides themselves on independence, being humbled by loss is not easy. It challenges their narrative. It forces them to see that detachment didn't protect them. It cost them. But let's shift the focus fully back to you for a moment. Because while they are processing internally, you are evolving externally. Every day you maintain your boundary, you reinforce your self-worth. Every time you resist the urge to check on them, you strengthen your independence. Every moment you choose healing over nostalgia, you reclaim emotional power, and that growth radiates. Even if they never see it directly, they feel the shift energetically because the dynamic has changed. You are no longer emotionally orbiting them. You are no longer waiting for crumbs. You are no longer interpreting silence as mystery. You see it clearly now. And clarity is something avoidants often struggle with especially when it exposes their own avoidance. If they ever do reach out, it may not be dramatic, it may be subtle, casual, testing the waters, seeing if access can be restored quietly, because access to them represents familiarity, safety, control. But here's the difference now. You are not the same person who once tolerated uncertainty. You understand your value. And that understanding shifts the entire equation. So as this journey reaches its final layer, let's anchor it in truth. Yes, they may be sad they lost access to you. Yes, it may hurt more than they expected. Yes, being cut off may have bruised their pride and stirred emotions they don't know how to name. But the most important transformation didn't happen inside them. It happened inside you. You learned that love without reciprocity drains you. You learned that patience without progress exhausts you. You learned that understanding someone's wounds doesn't require sacrificing your own needs. And you acted on that knowledge. That is strength. Avoidant psychology explains why they might process loss quietly, why pride may silence them, why regret may stay hidden behind independence. But psychology does not determine your worth. Their sadness, if it exists, is simply evidence that connection mattered. And you are not responsible for teaching someone how to value what they had. Sometimes the only lesson that reaches someone who avoids emotional depth is the experience of losing it. And sometimes the greatest closure you'll ever receive is knowing that your absence spoke louder than your presence ever could. You were not too much. You were not asking for the impossible. You were offering something real. And when someone loses something real because they were afraid to hold it properly, that loss echoes, maybe not immediately, maybe not visibly, but deeply enough to leave a mark. So let them feel it. Let them process it. Let them sit with the silence they once created, because you didn't just cut them off. You chose yourself. And that choice is something no avoidant pattern can take away from you. In the end, they didn't just lose access. They lost the version of you who would have stayed through anything. And that is a loss that lingers far longer than pride can pretend otherwise.